Welcome to episode 7 of the third season of the Simply Verified Beef podcast. The title of this episode is Trusted Water. We'll be talking about water quality and how producers can manage it on the farm. Our guests for this episode are Tracy Herbert, Extension and Communications Director for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and Tara Davidson, a producer from Saskatchewan. We'll be talking about water testing successes and where it can be improved for the future. Let's get started. So I'm wondering if both of you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, and what you do. And Tara, we'll start with you.
Sure. I ranch along with my husband and our young children in Southwest Saskatchewan. So we started the Lonesome Dove Ranch in 2005, and it is a large cow-calf and commercial purebred and commercial Galve farm. And yeah, we raise, like I said, cow-calf and also yearlings, and develop purebred cattle for selling through our annual yearling bull sale each year.
Great. Thanks, Tara. And Tracy.
Yeah, I work for the Beef Cattle Research Council. So my role is essentially focused on mobilizing the knowledge that's generated by producers as well as by scientists in useful ways, with the ultimate goal of increasing the competitiveness and resiliency of Canadian beef producers. And so what that means is we work to create communication channels for producers and researchers to learn from each other. And we develop and distribute science-based and economic-based materials to try to help producers make informed decisions. And then personally, I was raised on a mixed operation with purebred cattle in Northwest Saskatchewan. And currently my husband and kids call East Central Alberta home.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. For the next question, we'll start diving into the topic of today, which is water quality and water testing. And want to ask you both, why is water testing important for beef cattle producers?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, bad water can kill cattle, even when it seems to look fine. So testing is the way to truly know how good that water is or isn't. But testing isn't just to prevent a wreck, because if cattle don't consume enough water of sufficient quality, their growth and performance will suffer, but maybe not to a degree that's obvious. But it could be impacting things like weaning weights and open rates under the radar. And the quality can change from year to year, and sometimes even the course of a season. So, you can't just test each source once and be done, unfortunately. It needs to be monitored so your cattle are getting what they need to be as healthy and productive as possible.
So water testing, I mean, Tracy hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of, production issues that can go along with, not providing quality water for cattle, whether it, is impacting reproductive health, production parameters, weights, that sort of thing, right through to, worst case scenario where cattle actually, get very sick and even die on poor quality water or toxic water. So, certainly water testing is important to prevent those issues. Water, where I operate our farm in Southwest Saskatchewan, water is 100% always the limiting factor. So you can have feed, you can have grass, you can have forage, but if you don't have quality water, that limits a lot of what you can do with your land base and what you can do with your herd. So for us, water testing is really important on our farm. We do water test multiple sources. Most of our herd is on surface water, and that surface water quality will definitely change throughout the season. So from the beginning of summer to the end of summer. And of course, we've kind of been grappling with moisture deficiency for the last 7 growing seasons. So we've really seen firsthand water quality drop dramatically depending on different weather conditions and the lack of groundwater recharge. So we water test in order to prevent a wreck, but we also water test just to kind of keep a long-term record or benchmark, I guess, of what different fields, water sources, how that quality fluctuates throughout the season and over the years as well.
I really like that both of you mentioned the fact that we normally view water testing as kind of a way to avoid a wreck, or we only pay attention to it when there's something really wrong, but that there is kind of that consistent impact on performance that we might not notice all the time that still plays an important role. So I think that'll really play nicely into our conversation today, to think about it more every day than just when things are going really wrong. Tara, I want to ask you next, what has your experience been like with water testing, accessibility, and just how that all works in Saskatchewan?
Right. So we're really fortunate in Saskatchewan. We've always actually had access to pretty decent water testing capabilities and capacity right in the Southwest. And I think it just speaks to the fact that producers in the Palliser Triangle are really used to dealing with challenging water situations. So the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture has a lot of capacity for testing water samples same day results. So not necessarily lab analysis, but they will do same day tests for things like total dissolved solids or TDS, which you can kind of extrapolate different results from that number. So you can figure out your sulfates or a rough estimate of sulfates or electrical conductivity as well. And then the Ministry of Agriculture also offers lab analysis for any stock water samples submitted that producers choose to have a full panel done on. And we use those services often. So depending on whether our source is a well or a surface water source, such as a dam or a dugout, I'll definitely bring samples into the Ministry of Agriculture office throughout the year, and they can do a spot test that day to kind of tell me what the electrical conductivity is or what the TDS might be. And then for any water sources that we're using to build rations on, like a total mixed ration in the wintertime, for example, I will have a full lab analysis done on those water sources. Especially in our area, wells tend to be either shallow, so 30 to 50 feet deep, or very, very deep, 800 to 1200 feet deep. So we are on relatively shallow water wells, and those wells don't receive a lot of groundwater recharge, especially in the last several seasons. So the quality and different parameters of what is in that water panel, that has actually fluctuated quite a bit from one year to the next. So I really value being able to have an actual lab analysis done on those really important water sources that we're using to feed a lot of cattle on in the wintertime, especially.
Great to hear there's good access there. It's so important to have that really good programming in place, because obviously we've talked about how important this is, but none of us can monitor what we need to see if we don't have access to that. So it's good to hear that program is working really well in Saskatchewan. We've talked a little bit about, monitoring water over time, but as we've mentioned, things can change really quickly depending on weather and a lot of other factors. So, Tara, I'm curious what some of the warning signs are that you look for in terms of a water issue on the farm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we often kind of tend to look at animals to give us cues, but there's certainly a lot of other cues that I would look to before you notice an issue with your animals with respect to water quality. So looking at the water source itself, is it evaporating quickly? Is there, some sort of residue on the edges, like salinity, for example, that sometimes can be an indicator of higher electrical conductivity or higher TDS. And I also, weather patterns, like have we had a lot of hot, dry, windy days? Did any of these dugouts or dams recharge in the spring? Did we have much for runoff? So what I've done actually, when I went through the VBP audit process, I realized my cow-calf records were pretty detailed, but I didn't have that same caliber of records for our crops and pastures, for example. So I have a little binder just with kind of a screenshot of a Google Earth image of each pasture. And then I will actually run around and kind of take samples and write down what the TDS is, for example, for each water source. And then I have that record to look back on throughout the years. So I don't necessarily wait until the animals, perhaps are, if we had a preg checking issue. Fortunately, we haven't had that, but say, if we look back and had a preg checking issue, maybe we'd start thinking, well, is it water? I don't want to wait that long. I don't want to wait until the animals, maybe black animals maybe have a red tinge to their hair, which can be another sign that you have high sulfates. I don't want to wait that long. I'd rather kind of maybe look into it before it gets to that point. So that's kind of where looking at environmental cues, the water source itself, and then kind of looking back at how, maybe spot checks on water quality today stack up compared to past results that I've looked at in the past over time have.
Great point. Yeah, I think all of us would rather avoid the wreck before it happens than have to deal with it. So appreciate that that point for sure. And also, I like how you mentioned keeping records over time, because not every water source, the norm for each one won't be the same for a different one. So, good to have that reference point over time. We've talked a little bit about, Tara, how you're approaching testing water and needing to test different sources and when might be a better time than others. But maybe Tracy, I want to jump to you and ask, when is it kind of a good baseline of when producers should test their water? What's a good kind of regular schedule, or what triggers should they note to know that it's time to test their water?
Well, the general recommendation is, if you've got a water source that you've tested in the past, there's never been an issue, you have no reason to think that there's any changes, then once a year is probably sufficient. And you'd want to do that shortly before your cattle gain access to that water so that the test results are reflective of what they're currently or about to consume. But, if you notice any changes in like the smell or the clarity, certainly any changes in animal performance, their eating or drinking habits, or you're in a drought, you'd certainly want to retest more often than that.
Tara, anything to add on that question?
I guess I would mention that I also do have like a little handheld TDS meter, which is not the gold standard for, doing spot checks, but it does help me determine whether or not, I want to get those samples into a ministry office ASAP, for example. So if it tests fairly low as far as TDS on the meter, then I'm not as concerned. But if it does start to creep a little higher, then I think, yeah, those are kind of sources on my radar that I'm not going to wait around for. I'm going to prioritize those and get a better panel test done at the ministry office.
Great tip. For anyone interested, just curious where you got your TDS meter in case anybody's interested in getting one.
Yeah, for sure. So the ministry's actually looked at TDS meter results from these handheld devices. And I just want to point out that they have noticed there is a big disparity between an actual, in-office test versus the handheld one. So again, don't use these as, the gold standard for water testing at all, but they can provide a bit of insight, I guess, just at a certain point in time. So I just got ours from Amazon, and I also got a calibration solution along with it too, because then you can keep calibrating your meter back to the solution to make sure that it is as somewhat accurate as it possibly can be from a relatively economical Amazon purchase. But it is also kind of handy. We throw them in our saddlebags, like they fit, kind of, you can carry it on your person. So for example, if you're in a community pasture or a large pasture you're riding around, you can just kind of run out to the dugout and do a quick test there. And again, it's not going to be nearly as accurate as what you would find at the ministry office, but it might just be enough to say, whoa, you have a real problem here, or maybe you don't need to worry about this source as much as some of the other ones.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate you pointing out it's not the end all be all, but yeah, it's certainly good to have some tools just to do a quick gut check for sure on the farm too if you're riding by. Tara, we've talked a little bit about TDS, electrical connectivity, some of those things. So I want to kind of tie that together in terms of things that we see on water tests and ask, what are labs looking for in a water sample and why are those things important?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the other thing I'll point out too is you can definitely discuss these results with your veterinarian, for example, if you're concerned, or in our case, we use a nutritionist, and I always forward our water samples, especially close to when we're developing rations for the winter and throughout the fall, to them, because they will pick up on things that maybe we aren't looking at or even thinking of earlier too. And also the ministry has some excellent extension staff, and they can walk you through a lab analysis as well. But yeah, I mentioned like conductivity is one that I take a look at. TDS and total hardness and sodium. Sometimes you'll notice cattle going through salt a lot, or sometimes they aren't really touching their salt. Your sodium levels will play a role in that as far as what's available in the water. And then sulfates and nitrates. Those are probably the two that I really hone in on. So especially when we've had some, sustained years of drought where we're kind of feeding abnormal feeds or feeding things that we typically don't, or maybe drought stressed crops or hailed out crops or any other salvaged crops, sometimes nitrates can be an issue in the feed source itself, maybe not high enough to warrant concern. And then sometimes nitrates may also be an issue in the water source. Again, not enough to warrant concern when you look at the water and the feed individually, but cumulatively, you really want to make sure that you're not approaching toxic levels of nitrates when you combine the water along with the feed that you might be feeding. And same thing with sulfates. So in our particular example, sulfates is an issue in our on our farm, in our region in general. We tend to be challenged with higher sulfate water. And so that's something that's always on our radar. And depending on what you're feeding, for example, when you're refed canola silage, that's pretty high in sulfates. And then you already take a higher than normal sulfate water source. Combining those two, you have to be able to kind of offset potential issues that you might have feeding rations and watering cattle out of that water source. Or, for example, avoid other higher sulfate feeds such as DDGs is one example that has higher sulfates. So, just really looking at not just those individual levels in the feed ingredients and the water itself, but also what the potential cumulative impacts might be once they're all kind of mixed together in the real world.
Thanks, Tara. Appreciate the Coles Notes versions of what producers can look for on water test, but appreciate too that you recommended those resources of a vet and nutritionist, because I know for me sometimes I can think I understand what I'm looking at on the test, and then when that piece of paper comes, it's not quite as straightforward as you once thought. So it's good to have somebody to ask questions from too. We've talked a little bit, Tara, about your relationship with the Ministry of Agriculture in Saskatchewan in terms of water testing and really being able to go to them for extension resources as well. But Tracy, I want to ask, kind of on a more national, broader scale, where in general can producers go to access water testing?
Yeah, it depends very much on the province they're in. Unfortunately, the other provinces don't have the same capacity that the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture has. So, producers there are fortunate that they can work with a livestock and feed specialist in their region to talk to them not only about when and how to collect samples, get the testing done, how to interpret results, and then even how to make management decisions based on those. And so we here at the BCRC, we're working to create a list of all the resources and labs in each region across the country so producers can get a quick and applicable answer to that question wherever they are. That list is still in the works. And so I would say in the meantime, I'd recommend that producers contact either their provincial Ministry of Agriculture or their provincial cattle association to be pointed in the right direction.
Thanks, Tracy. Appreciate that. That's a big work in progress to get that list going, but I think it's something that producers will really appreciate because, we've talked about the need to do this consistently, but sometimes water testing is done kind of when it's an emergency. And so the last thing you want to have to be thinking about is tracking down a lab at the last minute. So very useful resource in the works for sure. Tara, you mentioned, again, your veterinarian and your nutritionist, and I just want to dive into that a little bit more and ask what role they play in handling water quality issues or helping with water testing.
Yeah, I would say our nutritionist definitely plays an important role. We actually got a nutritionist in the middle of the drought that we were kind of grappling with a few years ago, and it was a really wise investment. It was just really nice to bounce some ideas off of somebody who sees a lot of different scenarios on farm all the time, and it's really good to troubleshoot with them. So they provide us with some good ideas. And we also actually have a custom mineral blend that suits our specific herd's needs. So we have dived in a little bit deeper to figure out like what are our major overarching deficiencies, just region wise, like, in Saskatchewan, for example, what like copper deficiency is kind of a common one in our area. So what are some ways that we can counteract that with like a custom mineral blend? So we're really happy with that. Our veterinarian is great as well, but I would say, animal health issues, while many of them stem from water quality, I don't know that water quality is always top of mind for veterinarians as well. So, just kind of building your team a bit. And again, wherever you're located, whether you're, in Saskatchewan or out of Saskatchewan, any sort of extension specialist, they're kind of on the front lines and get a lot of calls in their offices to deal with issues that might be really specific to that area. So, contacting your extension office, whichever region you're in, I think is a good spot to start too, because they're the ones that hear a lot of issues, usually from other producers nearby.
Thanks, Tara. Liked your comment about bringing together a team around it. I think, we are experts in a lot of things as farmers and ranchers, and it's hard to be an expert at everything. So it's nice to have a team that you can rely on with some of the more technical knowledge and to provide some alternative perspectives or maybe different answers to a problem that's come up. We've talked a little bit about, what the ideal scenario is in accessing water testing and, what we would do in an ideal world. But what are some of the challenges facing producers that want to test water quality?
Yeah, so just this week I've been analyzing the results of the recent Canadian cow-calf survey that was done, and the report will be published on September 10th on beefresearch.ca. But what I've seen in the results so far is that in Saskatchewan, about 58% of respondents say that they test their quality at least once every 3 years. But those numbers are a lot lower in the rest of the provinces, likely due to the lack of water testing and extension capacity in the other provinces. But as Tara mentioned, unfortunately, producers, especially in southern Saskatchewan, are dealing with water quality issues on a regular basis. But on average, nationally, 62% of respondents say they never test their water. And of those who never test, the vast majority said it's because they assume the quality is good for various reasons, and so they just don't see the need to test. About 6% said that they're not confident that they can make or implement plans based on the quality, and 5% said that they're unsure how to collect or send a sample. Only 1% said that it was too expensive to test. And so, I think it's about, there's never a shortage of things to do in a day. And if you can't see an obvious problem, it's not at the top of your priority list. But hopefully the conversation today, will help producers think about, maybe some of the risks that they're taking if, water quality isn't something that they test occasionally. But there's logistical challenges for producers too. So, if you're wanting to test things like bacteria, where the sample needs to be maintained at a certain temperature range or get to the lab within a certain amount of time, sometimes that's just not possible, especially for producers in more remote areas.
Yeah, great point. It's not always the top of the list when, especially if there are challenges involved, it just makes it that much harder to kind of convince us that it's worth doing. So for sure, appreciate you pointing out those challenges. Kara, any challenges to add to that question?
Yeah, I think Tracy made a really good point about there's a lot of things to do on a farm in a day. So even though water testing is a huge priority on our farm, it still doesn't always get done. There's like a lot of urgent tasks that need to be done all at the same time, all in the same season as water testing. And to be honest, we have grappled with a few really challenging years where you don't know if you have enough water for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months for your herd. And sometimes it's really hard to go ahead and do the test because you maybe don't want to know what the results are, which I know is the opposite of what we're preaching. You can't manage something if you don't measure it, but it really can be a little bit daunting just because if you get those results back and they are, if you drop a water sample off at the ministry office and they call you within an hour, that it's maybe not the best results and they're anxious to get that news out to you as soon as possible so you can make some changes. So it can be challenging to figure out, where do I go with my herd next? What's the next step? Am I looking at hauling water now? Hauling water is no fun, as everybody who's ever done it can attest to. So there are some big challenges and big feelings, I guess, around water testing and water quality. But I think at the end of the day, you can't ever take your foot off the pedal. And there's some happy surprises too. I just, did a quick spot test on a water sample that did not look great. It reminded me that water, you cannot judge a book by its cover when you're looking at water. So this particular sample was fairly cloudy. Cattle looked fine on it, but we have quite a large herd on this source. So I thought, well, we're definitely going to test it. And it definitely tested very well. So very low TDS. Things look really good, and no concerns. But if you just happen to visually assess it, just looking at it, you might not have thought it was going to be as good as it was. So I guess just because you might be scared of what the result might be, you still have to keep doing the testing and coming up with plan A and plan B and plan C if you need to.
I love that you bring up the human element of this. We talk about best practices a lot, but there's always a person behind those things. And the reality of, okay, if we get a result that isn't favorable, what are we going to do from here is sometimes a real big obstacle. So I really appreciate that you brought up the emotional and human part of it. Tracy, I want to jump to you next and ask about the water quality working group that you're sitting on, and just get you to tell us a little bit about what it is and what it is that the group's doing.
Yeah, so the council prioritized water quality and extension, just recognizing all the various impacts that it has, not only on animal health and nutrition, but feed utilization, grazing management, environment, And so what we've done is we've developed a working group with collaborators from different organizations, including staff at provincial governments and industry organizations from nearly every province, to work together to create and share helpful tools and materials for producers and extension agents to use. And so, the amount of experience and knowledge in that group is astounding. And it means that we're, considering the needs and perspectives of producers in all various regions, and essentially have, an all-star team of people creating world-class decision tools for beef producers across the country, is what that is in a nutshell.
Awesome. That's very exciting. I think we've talked about it here today, that it's an important concern and consideration for producers. So great to hear there's a great team on the job. Curious what some of the tools that the group is developing are, and what has kind of come out of it so far.
Well, we started by doing a scan of what already exists in terms of things like fact sheets and videos and other materials, on a range of things. So on the general importance of water quality, how to get samples tested and interpret the results, water source and system choices, and common issues with maintenance or setting up a new system. And so after we did that scan, we could see where there are gaps and what would be most useful for the working group to create. And then we hosted 7 focus groups with producers in each region of the country and heard about the systems they're using, their knowledge and perceptions about water quality, and their experience with testing. And we asked for their candid feedback on some of our existing materials, and then showed them the list of ideas of the things that we want to create, and got their input on our work plan. And so that all informed our plans going forward. And so the things, there's a number of things that we're working on right now, including some updates to some of our existing resources based on the feedback we got from both the folks on the working group and the producers who participated in the focus groups. We're also doing a number of case studies, so interviewing producers across the country so we can write articles and put out episodes on the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, hearing producer perspectives on changing and upgrading their water systems, dealing with water when they're rotational grazing, managing water in the winter, switching to solar systems, all those types of things. And the one I'm most excited about is an interpretive guide that we're working to develop, which will have a summary of how to read test results and interpret what those readings mean. So for example, the effects of high sulfates, and then where in Canada you might be more likely to see different results. And that certainly, that tool wouldn't replace talking with an extension specialist or another expert, but it should help producers understand the issues in their particular water source, and then potential next steps in figuring out what to do about them.
That sounds like a really useful resource for producers that are either new to it or, are finding new things in their samples. It sounds like an exciting kind of one-stop shop for how to work through a water test results. So that's exciting. Tara, want to switch gears a little bit and kind of move from talking about the ideal scenario and what best practices look like and what progress we're making, and ask if you have any kind of real world stories from your own operation or maybe others where water quality testing has become important, whether that's an emergency that happened or maybe proactive testing that solved a wreck before it happened.
Yeah, I mean, several years ago, before this current cycle of drought that we're in, we did actually deal with some issues with polio in cattle. So that's when the cattle are drinking a water source that's high in sulfate. So you have to really counteract that, act quickly. We treat that with thiamine usually, and also other kind of additives in our mineral program. So that's kind of like the worst case scenario. You don't want to have to deal with animals that are grappling with that sort of deficiency to that level. But having said that, we have successfully treated animals and brought them back from that. And well, that was kind of in the early 2000s, back before our current situation is. It definitely informed us, moving forward. So we've always put water quality at kind of a high priority on our ranch, and it's just something to prevent wreck from happening for sure. And another thing too, we have really lengthened the use of our water sources and improve the quality by implementing different solar water systems. So, pumping water from the water source into a trough. I know we can always do better at providing more capacity, more storage at those sites, but we're doing the best we can and just pumping water from the source into a trough for cows and calves out in pasture. And it is amazing how much longer we can get out of some water sources. So I think I mentioned earlier, some sources, I'll look at them and we check them daily, especially in the heat of the summer. Things can go backwards really quickly. But so that's why a daily check is really important. And, there's lots of times, especially last summer, I check and you think, I don't know, do I have 2 days left on this water source, 2 weeks? How much longer can I get? And those water systems really did help lengthen the amount of time we could get out there. So, if possible, pump water, check the systems daily. Do not, I never recommend fully restricting access to a water source. We would put a simple hot wire around the water source so that if something really terrible happened, the cattle could still break through and get some water if they needed, because we don't ever want to put them in a position where they have no water at all. So just making sure you check those things daily, I think, is something I just really, really emphasize.
Thanks, Tara. Interesting to hear about the solar systems. I know I've heard a little bit about the quality, but interesting that you've seen that you can get so much longer out of those water sources. That's something I never would have thought of, and great to hear. Tracy, we've talked a little bit about some resources that are in development from BCRC, but just wanted to cover what BCRC currently has for producers that want to learn more about water quality in terms of resources.
Yeah, we've got a webpage that can be found at beefresearch.ca/water that's got information on potential issues, different systems and sources, how to improve pasture utilization with off-site water systems, some information about designing different types of systems. And then we've also got a calculator on there where folks can calculate the cost of installing a new system. And so what it does is it gives you the opportunity to compare the costs and benefits of different types of systems, either for cow-calf or a yearling grasser operation, and then determine how long it would take for that system to pay for itself based on the increased productivity in the animals that you can expect from providing pumped water versus direct access. And so you plug in the number of head that you've got, the expected sale price of your calves, answer some questions to help it figure out your own particular costs, and then it'll show you the number of years that it would take to pay off the initial cost, and then your net benefits at 5 and 7 years. So that's all at beefresearch.ca/water.
Sounds great. I will link that webpage in the show notes as well for anybody that's interested in visiting it. Last question, just to finish off, is for both of you, any last words of advice for producers on water quality?
I don't think I have too much to add other than, I can't emphasize enough how resilient and innovative producers are, as well as extension resources and support staff. There's no challenge that honestly can't be overcome if you start looping in some members of a bigger team, whether it's your veterinarian or nutritionist or your extension staff or, water quality engineers. Like it is really quite amazing how, when people come together, you can tackle some of these really big, tough challenges. And, producers have withstood quite a bit, and many producers are still really in the thick of a dry season again. And many people are, hauling water once again this season. But I give everybody a lot of credit for just sticking it through and, keeping on going and making sure that you're looking after your herds the best way that we can in these times.
Thanks, Tara. And Tracy, any last words of advice?
Well, I really appreciated how Tara mentioned earlier about like looking at their records and taking the time to analyze them. And because it gives you the opportunity to spot where there might be areas for room for improvement. And so, by prioritizing that and taking the time to analyze those records, you can make a plan, implement some changes, and then look for signs for improvement when you look through those records in the next few years. beefresearch.ca has lots of different practical tools on all kinds of things, including, these courses that we've got that'll help producers who want to sharpen their skills on record keeping and analysis. And they can be found at beefresearch.ca/courses. And for anybody who wants to receive those new resources that are in development that I mentioned, if they want to get those directly in their inbox as soon as they're available, they can join one of the BCRC's email lists at beefresearch.ca/subscribe.
Thanks, Tracy. And I'll link the webpage to the courses and then the subscription to BCRC's email subscriptions as well, just so that folks can easily access that from the show notes. I want to thank you both for joining me today and having such a great conversation about water testing and water quality. I think there's lots of practical tips for producers here and lots of resources that they can go to learn more. So appreciate you both providing your perspective. That's it for episode 7 of the 3rd season of the Simply Verified Beef podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Simply Verified Beef.